Good morning, and welcome to our final session for climate change. What can I do? I am delighted to welcome you back again this morning. I know it's early. We don't have quite as many people online at this point, but hopefully a few more will join us as we go. I should just give a quick shout out. We decided, and thank you, Donna, for the suggestion to add a bit of music last night and this morning, just so you had something to listen to besides the silence of the screen as you join. And that music did come courtesy of my choir at St. Stephen's here in Ottawa. We are very blessed to have some very talented people, including technical people, that take recordings that people do at home and mix them together into something that sounds like we're all standing in the room together. So that has been a blessing to our congregation through the pandemic. I hope it's been a blessing to you as well. And actually the video we're going to listen to this morning, the music before Norman starts, is also from my choir. You'll actually get to see our faces. So we will get to that in just a moment. It was our Thanksgiving virtual anthem for this year. But before we do that, just a couple of reminders. I think we're all getting pretty good at all of this. I see everyone's got their microphones muted, so thank you for that. We'll continue to use the same process for Q&A and for chatting in small groups. So hopefully everyone's got that figured out. Just a reminder, you can still buy the book if you'd like through the Eventbrite site, and you can also buy Norman's new book if you're interested, and you can look him up by name and all of his books show up. Google's a wonderful thing. Okay, so sorry, I just got a message saying there was something with the link. So that may be one of the reasons we don't have quite as many people on here, as the link that went out in the email this morning seems to have not, although I used it this morning. So in any case, you've made it here and we're glad. I'm going to open us up in prayer, and then we'll go to our video, and then Norman will start chatting with us. Let us pray. Lord of all creation, we are here this morning to think about food and about what we put in our bodies and what you've put around us and how that relates to the way that we care for the planet. We thank you for the things that we have learned over this week so far, and we thank you for what we're going to learn today. Open our hearts and our minds so that we may hear the message you have for us today through Norman and through our conversations with one another. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Look at the world and Think of the warmth of summer, bringing the harvest before the winter's cold. Everything grows, everything has a season, till it is gathered to the Father's fold. Praise to thee, O Lord, for all creation. Give us thankful hearts that we may see all the gifts we share and every blessing. All things come of thee. Every good gift, all that we need and cherish, comes from the Lord in token of His love. We are His hands, stewards of all His bounty. His is the earth and His the heavens above. Praise to thee, O Lord, for all creation. Give us thankful hearts that we may sing all the gifts we share and every blessing. All things come of thee. All things come of thee.
Well, thank you for sharing your choir with us, Meg, and thank you also for all your good work facilitating our sessions. I know that's not a small thing to be doing, so you're doing it very well. So yes, this morning I want to talk with you about food, and I want to say that I love food. And I know that I shouldn't take that for granted because there are a good number of people who have a love-hate relationship with food. And of course, food is an intensely personal reality, the eating that people do. So I don't want to presume that everybody loves food like I do. And I thought that we could use this morning to talk about food because food is one of these realities. Eating is a practice that we all do multiple times a day. And one of the reasons I think we don't think that much about it is that we often take it for granted. And again, this is, I think, something fairly new in the history of humanity, because if you go back not so long ago, most people spent a good part of their days either finding food or growing food or hunting food. And so it was never to be taken for granted that people would eat. We're in a rather unusual time where most people in our circles, right? I know that there are still plenty of people who go hungry in our world. But for people like you and me, it's pretty rare for us to worry about whether or not there will be food in a store. And that's a pretty new situation in the history of humanity. I want to focus on eating for several reasons. One of the big ones is that eating, more than any other activity really, stitches us into the natural world, or put another way, it roots us in the world around us in ways that are very, very clear from a strictly physiological level. And I also want to focus on food and eating because we know that agriculture and food production, food distribution, food processing, that these activities are contributing enormously to greenhouse gas emissions. Depending on who you talk to, some geographers, meteorologists will suggest that it's upwards of 30% of greenhouse gases are produced through agriculture and food production. This is why it's so important for us to tend to what we're doing in our food systems. It's also important to note, and this is something that came up briefly last night, is that regenerative agricultural practices, which really make the fertility of the soil a high priority, can actually contribute to carbon sequestration, which is, of course, a very, very important element in our efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions. So if we get agriculture right, if we get our eating right, we can do so much to transform the world and to address this very, very important issue of climate change. I have a dream, and in this dream, people from faith communities all around the world discover how through their own spiritual traditions, their own faith traditions, they have important things to say about what food is and how we should eat it. And if we were to act on our own faith traditions, we would literally change the world. But I don't think this is going to be easy for several reasons. Why? Well, one is that we live in a world where, as I've said before, food has become a commodity. It's a product that is readily available. It's in the stores. It's on the shelf. And what has been striking about the way food has been produced over the last several decades is that it is now packaged and presented almost intentionally as a way of dissolving any attachments to the natural world. So that when you go into a store, especially if you buy the food in the central aisles, you will find everything beautifully packaged. And when you look at the ingredients list, it's very hard to even know what's in the food because you can't pronounce half the stuff. And so all the vestiges of nature that you would recognize, they tend to have disappeared. Now, it's different, of course, if you are on the outside aisles where you're buying fruits and vegetables, dairy products and such. But even there is an important effort being made to sort of disabuse you of the notion that these vegetables came from the ground, or that these vegetables might have been attractive to other insects, right? Which is why if you find apples or tomatoes that are not perfectly round or have any sign that a bug has tried to eat them too, you won't buy them. Or if you go into the meat aisles or sections, you tend not to find feathers or fur, maybe not even blood, because that has become somewhat repulsive. And so much of the food that we find in stores doesn't really communicate how we are connected to a natural world through our eating. And this is a deception that we need to resist. We need to find ways for people to appreciate how eating joins us, not just to animal life, but to plant life, to soil life, to the meteorological circles through which all life moves. There is no food apart from clean, fresh water. There is no food apart from fertile soil. There is no food apart from plant and animal diversity, right? I think you all have heard some about the concerns that we have about pollinator species like bees, right? If we lose the bees, people, our eating comes to an end. It is that simple, because so much of our crop production depends upon pollinators like bees. And so for people to not be aware of the importance of bees and therefore of bee habitat and about the many pesticides we are spraying on our agricultural lands, which we believe to be causing bee death syndrome, we should be very concerned as eaters. Or think about the microbiome. I hope you all have heard about the microbiome that is in your gut, but there's also a microbiome in the soil, which is a very close mirror analogy to our own. So if you don't know, the microbiome refers to this gastrointestinal system that is within us, that is host to trillions, right? Did you hear me? Trillions of microorganisms. So when you eat, you don't eat food that is just for yourself. You're eating food to feed the microbiome. And if the microbiome in our bodies is not healthy, we suffer dramatically. So when I talk to people about this, I tell them, you are not you. You are, in fact, a zoo. And why are you a zoo? Because you are host to billions of species of non-human life, and they are integral to your own existence. So to take care of our microbiome, we have to take care of the microbiome that is in the soil. And I think maybe you have heard that soil is a miracle. Just to lift up a handful of soil contains more diversity of life than the whole planet. So soil is a marvel, and we need to take care of it. And then one other dimension, because obviously farming is not just an ecological reality, it's a social economic reality. And that means we have to be attending to the agricultural communities that grow our food. How are they doing? And we'll have some time to get back to this a little bit later in the presentation. But what we know is that economics have been stacked against farmers for now over 10,000 years. So let's now get to the more theological side of this. We should be astounded by the fact that God creates a world in which creatures, all creatures, need to eat. Why? Well, because for you to eat, others have to die. This is obviously a serious and deep matter, and it's hard for us to negotiate, which is, I think, part of the reason why in our stores we don't like to have vestiges of natural life on display, because it's very, very hard to deal with the truth that for us to eat, others have to die, right? Every once in a while when we have guests over and we say a blessing over the meal, and if we're serving meat, I will say, thank you for the chicken that died so that we can eat it. And as soon as I finish the prayer, people say, I don't want to eat anymore. And I think, is this a surprise? You didn't know that this was once a living chicken? But for many people, it is a surprise. And it's a serious thing for us to navigate. How do we make ourselves worthy of consuming the life of another? And why does God want a world in which creatures need to eat to live? This is serious because it's not obvious that God didn't want or couldn't have created a world in which we don't need to eat, and therefore we can avoid all the death associated with eating. But that's not the world that we find ourselves in. And what I want to suggest to you is that the reason eating is central to the very movement of this natural created world is that eating is an invitation into the shared membership of life, right? This is the fundamental insight I want us to be thinking about today. Eating, rather than being something that we just do haphazardly, regularly, but not thinkingly, this is a mistake. Eating is the way by which we show whether or not we're going to live responsibly, graciously, and charitably in a world in which all of us depend upon each other to thrive. Now, what we need to see then is that food, rather than simply being a commodity, is actually better understood as God's love made nutritious. Or as I also like to say, food is God's love made delicious. Right? That's not a trite thing to say, because I hope you've all had the experience of fresh raspberries on frozen ice cream or custard. Are you not astounded by the fact that God creates a world that tastes so good, or at least has the potential to taste so good? It's a truly wonderful thing, and it is one of the most basic declarations of God's love for us, that God creates a world that can nourish us and delight us with such delicious flavors. And this leads us to something very important to say. When we think about food and we think about the act of eating, what we are doing is we're actually responding to God's declaration of love. Think about it this way. I hope you all have the experience of either inviting someone to your home for a meal or being invited by someone to their home for a meal. Now, what's being communicated when you do that or when you receive such an invitation? Well, it's an invitation that communicates love as fundamentally an exercise in hospitality, which says, we want to welcome you into our presence. We want to nurture you. And then we want to empower you to leave our home to live the life that is uniquely yours to live. And do so knowing that you have the love, the support, and the encouragement of the host. It's an amazing thing. Think about the number of people who don't experience hospitality. Well, the deep theological insight here, and this has been expressed by some Christian theologians through the ages, most notably John of Damascus, one of the great theologians of the early church, who said that God's creating of the world can be characterized as one lavish act of hospitality. Why? Because in creating the world, God first makes room, right? Welcomes into God's own life something that is not God, namely creatures, and then says, I'm going to nurture you. I'm going to give you the food you need to eat. And then in giving you that food, affirm your unique life so that you can develop and grow and experience all the things that are uniquely within your ability to do. It's an amazing thing that is, first of all, a description of love, but it's also a practical thing because it helps us understand that life moves by the love of gift giving, the love of nurture providing. One of the most important things we see in Scripture is that eating is one of the ways that we can nurture the world that nurtures us. And there are multiple places that we could go to Scripture to talk about how this works itself out. But let's just focus, for instance, on John 6, where we have a passage describing what is the pretext, I would say, for what comes to be called the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. You'll remember that in John 6, there's 5,000 people, roughly, who have come to hear Jesus, and they're out on a field, and they've been listening to Jesus, and they're getting hungry. And so the disciples say, let's send them to the village to go get food. And Jesus says, no, we can't do that. We have to feed them. And so the disciples say, how are we going to do that? So they go out in the crowd and they find this young boy who's got loaves and fish. And the disciples bring this to Jesus. And Jesus, as you remember, does the miraculous thing of multiplying this gracious gift of food so that everybody there can be fed. And there's so much left over that there are baskets of leftovers, right, that are going to be used for further nurture. Now, what's Jesus doing here? I like to think that Jesus is actually building on the good sense of this boy's mother, because the mother, in giving this boy loaves and fish, clearly was thinking in a hospitable manner, because this boy was not going to eat all those loaves and fish by himself. She gave enough for this boy to share. And Jesus builds on this sharing mother by extending that sharing to the 5,000. Why? Because that's what food is. Food is for sharing. And then Jesus does something remarkable. Of course, we learn that the people are very excited that Jesus multiplies the loaves and fish, because for a culture in which many people are on fairly intimate terms with hunger, to have a man like Jesus around who can produce on demand so much food, who wouldn't want to make a person like that king, right? The grocer king, because he provides all of our groceries. But Jesus says, that's not who I am. You have misunderstood me if you think that what I'm doing is just here to provide you the food you need to eat. I'm here to actually do something much more important, which is to use food as a way of transforming your life. And so Jesus says this most arresting thing. He says, I am the bread of life. And unless you eat me, you have no life in you. The disciples are a bit put off by what Jesus has just said, because the Greek verb that he uses is tragain, which means to chomp and chew. And Jesus is in fact saying, unless you chomp and chew, masticate on my flesh, you have no life. That's a pretty repulsive way of speaking. I don't see any of us going around and gnawing on the arms of people that are near us. That would be revolting. So the question is, what is Jesus saying when he argues that these people need to learn to eat his flesh? And what he says is, I need to abide in you, and you need to abide in me. And the abiding needs to happen at the most visceral level, namely at the level of our eating, our gustatory need. And the idea, I think, at work here is that as we take in Jesus as our nurture, he transforms us from within so that we can be nurture for others. And this is not just sort of mystical, pious way of speaking. We see this actually worked out in the early church community. Think about Acts. When they came under the power of the Holy Spirit, what did they do? They came together and they ate together. They shared what they had. They were joyous. They were known to the people around as being glad and welcoming. And then in a remarkable line, we're told that there wasn't a single one among them who had need. Right? This is a community that by eating in remembrance of Jesus became a hospitable community that took care of their communities such that none of them had need. And this is at the core of why this early Christian community simply grew and grew and grew to the surprise of all of their pagan members. So now, what does this mean for us today? I think what it means primarily is that we learn to think as Christian communities how the vast dimensions of eating and food production, how these can be transformed to be witnesses to God's hospitable ways with us. And this happens at multiple levels, right? Think first of all about agriculture. What would we need to do in agriculture so that the soil becomes a site through which the hospitality of God's love for creatures could be made manifest? Farmers know how to do this, right? It's called regenerative agriculture, because what it does is it builds on the microbiome, it builds microorganisms, it adds carbon to the soil. And in doing so, it creates the conditions for not just fertility, but for rich flavors in our food, right? When we begin to appreciate how the first job of good farming is to feed the soil that feeds us, that means we're going to have a different kind of agriculture. And by feeding the soil, what we are doing is we're sequestering carbon, which is directly linked to climate change. So we start with agriculture, developing the kinds of agricultural systems in which farmers can become genuine caretakers of the soil and the plants and the animals. And this is difficult because I know many farmers, and they're working within economic policy government contexts, which make it very difficult for them to do what they most want to do. And so it's important for us, I think, as church people, as congregations, to understand, first of all, the difficulties that farmers face when they do the kind of work that they're trying to do. And this has, I think, really important implications. You've all heard, I think, of community supported agriculture. One of the things I would love to see is church supported agriculture. And this, what I mean by church supported agriculture takes many dimensions, but one of them might be, first of all, for congregations to get to know what farmers' realities are actually like. And that means inviting farmers into your pulpits, into your Bible studies, to let them talk about what it is that they're experiencing in their day-to-day work. And then for churches to partner with farmers, right? Community supported agriculture works on the idea that patrons commit to paying weekly prices for shares, and the shares take the form of boxes of food that are delivered every week. And what's wonderful about this system is it helps that the farmer doesn't have to absorb all the risk of food production by themselves, right? When they have patrons who are willing to pay and then accept whatever comes in the box each week, because farming is about surprise. Things don't always work out the way you want. The farmer knows that they will have a good income, a reliable income. What if churches were to partner with farmers? What if church people said, we want to help you as a farmer or a farming community do the things that you believe to be right, and in our supporting you, witness to the love of God in the world? Right now, we're seeing an explosion of community farms started by congregations and faith communities all across North America. It's a beautiful thing to see. It's a powerful witness because, as I've heard lots of people say who are not churchgoers, they'll say things like, the church is actually doing something beautiful here. How do you argue against a garden that is growing good food for people, that is growing flowers for people? This is a powerful, powerful witness. But then I think congregations, faith communities can take it a step further. Church-supported agriculture means that churches don't just come alongside farmers to help them with their production. Faith communities also come along farmers by becoming advocates for farmers at the policy level. Right now, we don't have a lot of faith leaders who are speaking in Ottawa or in Washington, D.C., or at the UN, advocating for farmers to be able to do the kinds of agriculture they most want to do, because they don't see how policy is affecting at the most basic level what farmers are allowed to do, what they're enabled to do, right? I could go into this, and we can maybe do this in the question and answer period, but farmers have been under intense pressure for years and years to maximize yield because the profit margins in farming are so narrow. And so many farmers find themselves doing things that they don't want to do, but they have to, simply to survive. I think it's important for faith communities to become advocates for farmers so that they can start doing the agriculture or continue doing the agriculture that they most want to do. And then one other thing I'll mention, and then we can go to question and answer time, is I think it would be wonderful if church communities would play the role of being the hubs for local food economies. What I mean by this is not simply food banks, right, or soup kitchens. These are valuable in many instances, but we need to get beyond a model of food handouts or charity and move towards what's called food justice and food democracy. And that's going to happen when communities have leadership hubs, right? And faith communities can be one of these, that are advocating for locally well-produced food, that are arguing for local processing, right? So that I think you may know that one of the real difficulties for farmers is how to process and distribute their food, because distribution chains work with big outfits, and it's much more difficult to handle small-scale production. Well, what if faith communities were to become the sorts of hubs that help these farmers who are smaller scale, that are growing real good food, fruit, vegetables, poultry, dairy products, cheese, whatever? What if they became centers that help farmers get their food to consumers and connect consumers with good producers? This would be, again, a powerful witness to God's hospitable ways with the world. I mentioned yesterday that in the chat, in the town hall, that one of the really striking things to me is when I've been in conversation with people from Africa who are thinking about the role of the church there, agriculture and healthcare are major concerns. What if churches in the North American context were to say, we're also going to make agriculture and healthcare primary concerns? That would be a major shift in the way we think about mission. But as I hope you've already seen, it would be the kind of shift that would position faith communities to do something powerful to address environmental concerns, our food systems, and therefore also climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norman. That was wonderful and gave lots of really interesting things to think about. I'm going to open things up now to those who are here to share your thoughts or your questions for Norman. We'll have about 25 minutes for Questions and conversation before we go into small groups? Gassan.
We used to say always that a successful educator, tutor can engage his audience and trigger thoughts and questions within his audience. So I have two small questions for Dr. Norman. So yes, at a time where social media and large corporation and artificial intelligence are dominating most of the political and economical decisions, how do you see your call to the agrarian initiative will have a listening ear? And the second question, from your exposure to the education system, do you think the current curriculums can help prepare a generation that is thankful and able to establish in the future kind of feasible liberal democracies to break the imbalanced cycle in nature? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. And they're I think quite closely related to each other, because you're asking about, what are the levers to change the way we think about food and food consumption, food purchasing, and so forth. And I think you're right to put your finger on education. And I want to just take a little bit of time to talk about this, because one of the things that has been so destructive about our food system is how anonymous it is. And what I mean by that is that we live in a food system where people don't know where their food comes from. They don't understand how their food comes to be what it is. So people don't realize, right, that there is such a thing as a cow that produces the milk that makes the ice cream that you enjoy. Now, we're getting better, right? We've had journalists now writing for a good time about how food comes to us, but it's still very much head knowledge. They don't appreciate what it means to say that ice cream comes from a cow or depends upon a cow. Because then you have to ask the question, what does the cow need to survive, to be healthy? And what we see is that so many dairies are not producing healthy milk because the cows are not eating grass, because they're being fed other diets, because they're in enclosed facilities. Cows are ruminants, which means they're supposed to eat grass. And grass-fed milk is so superior to grain-fed milk. So what we have to do is we have to enlarge the food imaginations of people so that they don't just have a slight cognitive awareness that, oh yeah, tomatoes actually grew in the ground, right? Or that carrots, they actually were in the ground and not just above the ground hanging from trees, like sometimes kids think, or that the pasta that you see, spaghetti, that's not the same thing as the stalk of wheat that's in the field, right? We need to educate young people, but more deeply, I think we have to enlarge their imaginations to see that they have a sympathetic relationship to land and plants and animals. And that comes through embodied engagement. So this is, again, a reason why I think church-supported agriculture can matter, because what if churches were to take their young people, well, not just the young people, the adults too, onto farms so people can meet, right, animals, can touch soil, can see plants grow and sense their vulnerability, but also their splendor and their beauty. Because you're right, as long as we think that algorithms or artificial intelligence are going to handle the logistics of food, we're sorely mistaken that we're going to cultivate the kind of imagination that will encourage us to love land, not just manage land, to love farmers and farming communities, not just manage them. That's the crucial hurdle that I think we need to overcome, because as long as we're just in a managerial ethos, we're just going to worry about efficiency of production, profitability of production, ease of consumption, convenience of consumption. And that's not enough, because what we need to do is figure out how to activate the love in people, because it's love that's going to encourage us to make the kinds of sacrifices we need to make to bring about a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Laura to ask her question.
Thanks, Meg. Dr. Wurzba, this is just so exciting. As I think about how to build on what the community I serve is already doing. So I serve the Church St. Columba by the Lake that Ian Fraser did before, and Carolyn Begg, who was on the board last night, she's on the board of Corbeil de Pin, and that happens to reside in our church building. So we're a bit of partners a little bit with them. So people have a real heart for food ministry, we call it. We have a part-time food ministry coordinator, and some of our produce, goes to the West Island Mission Food Bank and so on. So the groundwork is there, but we still find that there's a disconnect. There's a real heart for hospitality and providing local food, and there's been nourishing food, and there's been some connection to theology. Certainly as pastors, we try to do that. But I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how to have conversations with people to activate that love, so that it's not just one small group that's really passionate about it, or the session in our case, but also the entire congregation. Some of those questions, like we talked about conversation yesterday. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I'm really excited to learn about what you're doing in your congregation. It's just wonderful. I mean, I think one way to start is simply to talk more about it and help people understand that this is not just a boutique concern that some members of a congregation might have because maybe they have a green thumb or an overly guilty conscience or whatever. Make it theological. And what I mean by that is speak to people with scripture about this, right? And I can't tell you enough how important this is. I sometimes, when I go to congregations and talk about these kinds of issues, I will highlight passages that refer to God as a gardener or as a farmer or as a shepherd. And I'll unpack why we worship a gardening God. And I will often find in that audience several people who are weeping. And they'll come up to me afterwards and they'll say, I've been a gardener my whole life. I have long felt that this is work that honors God, but I've never once heard God described as a gardener. And that's so important to do because it affirms the good work that people just by doing it already sense to be important and godly, but they've never been affirmed for that work as being godly. So naming it is really, really important to do. I can't overemphasize that because right now, so many people are wondering about whether or not what they do matters or how it might matter to God that we do it. But if we start our sort of education and our preaching around Genesis 2, where God asked the first human being to till and keep the garden, that has so often been interpreted as a punishment because gardening's hard, right? And we have to be upfront about that. This is not easy because when you garden, you come across your own impotence, your own ignorance, your own frustration, your own impatience. So we have to be honest about these things. But we have to realize that when God asks us to take care of the garden, God is actually saying, I want you to join with me in my gardening ways with the world so that you can discover not just the beauty of creation, but also its vulnerability and its fragility. And in coming to have that sort of intimate relationship with creatures and places, you have a better insight about my love for the world. Because God, as many Psalms we could point to, describe, right? God is constantly attending to the land. God's eyes are constantly on the land. And were God to ever turn away from the land, everything would die. So to help people understand that when they do this work, they are participating in God's ways with the world is tremendously affirming. But it also can be tremendously inspiring to people who otherwise have thought, well, why would gardening matter? It's just for people who've got a green thumb, right? Well, actually not. It's the fundamental human vocation, not just because it helps us feed ourselves, but because it gives us better insight into who God is. And that, I think, is a real game changer for people.
Thank you, Norman. I'm a fairly recent gardener because I have a little more time, and I was planting something the other day and found half a brick from an old construction project in my garden. There's probably a metaphor there too. Mary Ann asked a really interesting question in the chat that I just wanted you to think about. She says, what can churches do to help areas in our communities where people find it difficult to get fresh food deserts?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And what I often will say is the argument to addressing food injustices is not expensive food, right? That's not the way to proceed. Why? Because it plays into a system that is itself a problem that needs to be adjusted. So the solution to addressing poverty is often going to be at the level of policy, because right now, governments, and I don't know in detail how it works in Canada, but certainly in this country, the reason a bottle of Coke is cheaper than a bottle of water, or that an apple is more expensive than a bag of Cheetos, is because of government subsidies. And if we were to actually subsidize real food production, the cost of these foods would be so much less. So that's one dimension. Another one is that we can turn our attention to local food economies and actually participate in the growing of food ourselves, or growing it together, because this is often going to be a way that empowers people. It also does so much, right, to adjust and address the kinds of inequities in communities, because we know that in many instances, there's lots of land that would be available to grow food together, but it's been abandoned, or it's been zoned in such a way as to make it impossible to farm. This again is where faith communities can play an important role by joining with communities that are unable to access good food. Another thing to do, of course, is to work with what's already existing so that farmers markets will accept things like food stamps. That's happening in this country now, because we know that oftentimes people want to have access to good food, but they can't do it because their food stamps won't work in a farmer's market, for instance. So there are lots of different levers. And I think the thing to do is for congregations to get in touch, right? Form relationships with communities that are struggling around food insecurity, and see how you can partner together. Because yeah, there are major sort of historical factors. There's a reason why food deserts are what they are. There's often been government policy behind it, or it just doesn't make economic sense for grocery stores to be there. Well, that's something that faith communities can address. That's what I would argue.
Thank you. Colleen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. I mean, the reality, the history of Canada is that people came to this country and cleared land and farmed. You know, the whole foundational structure of the nation state of Canada, you know, you go through the whole history of it. And, you know, more recently now we're urbanized. But most farmers today farm for the international or the commodities market. They're not farming to feed people locally. And I remember listening to somebody doing a presentation from the UN, I think she was from India, and she discussed the fact that the reality is most agriculture isn't about feeding people locally. It's about something else, like you have alluded to. And so, you know, you talked about engaging farmers, and my husband and I have ministered in rural congregations most of our life. And the farmers there, with some few exceptions, you know, when I was near Hamilton, some of the farmers were very successful because they could set up their little shop on the corner of their land and do value-added stuff. But most farmers don't do that, and they are commodity farmers. So I think we have to give ourselves a reality check to say, who are we talking about? Mm-hmm. And, you know, and really, honestly, I spend my whole day cooking food, preparing food, not trying to waste food, yada, yada, yada. and it's a lot of work. And I just can't imagine trying to feed my family on a garden. I know my grandmother grew a wonderful garden and my thought of her inspires me, but I don't think she could feed her family on her garden.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to tell you, other than that I just feel like, there's a striving here. There's a theology here that of life and death that I think you're kind of touching on, but I'm not sure if you're really getting it and you're distracting us.
Oh
Sorry.
my, okay. All right, so you're absolutely right. So here's two things I would say right off the top. We have to attend to the history of agriculture, which you're absolutely right to say. And we need to understand how quickly agriculture changed in Canada. All right. How we moved from a smaller scale family farm enterprise, much more focused on serving local needs, to what you just described, growing commodities for international markets. To think that that is somehow inevitable is a delusion, right? All sorts of forces made that happen. And my question is, what role can faith communities play in reversing that? To think that it is not reversible is to give in to cynicism. And that, I think, is the big danger. And I can give you examples of how giving into cynicism is precisely the temptation we must avoid. So where I live here in North Carolina, Central, it's the Triangle region. If you came here 30 years ago, there was no real small scale farm production that was serving local community needs. There was no farm to fork movement. There was nothing. But there were a few area farmers who realized that commodity production was no good for the land. It was no good for people. It was no good for communities. So they started the first farmers market in Scarborough, and they got a few other farmers to decide, well, we're going to grow some food for people. We're not going to grow commodities to make diapers or high fructose corn syrup or whatever. We're going to grow real food, and we're going to grow it in a way that honors the land, honors the animals, and honors eaters. So they started this farmers market. 30 years later, the Triangle region in North Carolina is a showcase for transformation, because what's happened is we now have a vigorous small-scale agriculture scene that is producing good food, and it's producing food in a way that people can access, right? All sorts of organizations have sprung up around this, and it's transforming the agricultural landscape and the food landscape of this region in North Carolina, so that you can hardly go to a restaurant any longer and not find on the menu descriptions about the area farm that grew this food, that provided this food. Now, the reason I bring this up is it's so important to think that what we have today is not inevitable, right? If we think it's inevitable, then we can just pack up our bags and go home. And my argument is not to say that everybody grows all their own food. Very few people have been able to do that. The point is to develop a system of agriculture that is honest about the fact that the future of agriculture, if it continues down the path of commodity production as it currently is a dead end, because it presumes soil degradation, water wasting and poisoning, and it assumes growing farmer debt. All three of those are recipes for disaster. So we have to be able to think about a different way of doing agriculture. And what I'm trying to suggest is that faith communities can play a major role, right? Because they have the moral, spiritual resources to inspire it to develop a different kind of agriculture. And we know it can be done because I just mentioned the Triangle region in North Carolina. There are many other places you could point to where similar things are happening.
Thanks, Norman. There's a few people in the chat that have been talking about urban farms, which
Right.
have been popping up. They're Victoria, Toronto, Ottawa. I don't know if they're doing it in Montreal or not, but where farmers are renting land from homeowners to grow their crops, and then the homeowner gets a share, and then they're able
Right.
to sell the rest. And it's, to my knowledge, all of those are
Yeah, urban
for eating.
Yeah, urban agriculture is a hugely exciting development. It's not entirely new, and this is also something that's worth saying. I mean, historically, the wall between farm and city was not really a wall, right? People moved back and forth between them, and we know that some of the earliest cities had all kinds of livestock within the physical walls of the city. And so to think that farming is something that happens out there, separate from our urban existence, right? That's something we need to resist because historically it's just not true. And then secondly, it's enormously exciting because when we bring agricultural production into our cities, we encourage citizens to understand, for instance, their embodied connection to land, to plants, to animals. And that's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. So we are almost out of time for our Q&A. I'm going to invite Tom to ask his question. Janet, I'm not sure if we're going to have time for yours, but it might be something we can chat about separately. Tom?
Yes, good morning, Reverend Meg. This is very interesting. I think in Canada, we are very lucky. If you compare our situation, our social context, say compared to Haiti or Honduras or a third world country in Africa, where food is vital. We have food, okay, but what I was really interested in is we were talking about the anonymous nature of the food system. And that's something that's quite fascinating to me. If you go to a mall or you visit a grocery store in the United States, all the restaurants are basically the same. They produce the same ingredients from the same type of production. You go to a supermarket and you see the same labels and the same sources. Chickens that are raised in batteries, cows that are raised in sort of sheds, things like that. And I think it's that anonymous nature. My question is to do with that sort of connection between farmers and consumers. That there seems to be a tremendous lack of knowledge within the general public about food sources and where it comes from. And I'm not sure, I think this is what Dr. Norman is trying to get to, is there's a disconnect between our understanding of food. We simply show up at a mall and we buy a Kentucky Fried Chicken, or, we buy a McDonald's hamburger, but we don't really fully understand the process of it. And my question is, I think, is this part of what he's trying to identify, is this sense of consumerism of the food. We just get a product at the end of the day that's food. We don't understand the nature of how that food is produced or where it comes from. If you go to Haiti and you have a chicken dinner in Haiti, some guy will go out the back, take a chicken, chop its head off, pluck the feathers and cook it for you. It's very different than what we have. And I just wanted to make sure I've got the right understanding of this. Like it was suggested that there should be a shift in primary concerns for the church in food and healthcare, and also with an educational component to try to bridge that gap of understanding. Am I right with this, Professor Norman?
That's exactly right. And I think the connection has to be more than just a cognitive connection, right? The kind of understanding that we want to try to cultivate in people is an affective understanding, right? It's the kind of understanding that farmers have. So for instance, when a farmer goes out into a field and sees a blight that's damaging their crop, their bodies ache. Or when they're in the middle of calving season and a calf dies, their bodies ache, because it's not just that the animal is an object out there. The animal is part of a community of life. A field, the plants, they're part of a community of life. There's kinship happening here. And this is something that is not acknowledged enough when we talk about traditional agricultural communities. The kind of love that circulates through their daily activities, because it's only love that convinces you to go out there and try to help a cow give birth in the middle of the night. It's only love that gets you out distributing hay when it's raining and blizzarding, or it's only love that gets you out in sun that'll just burn your face off, because it's just been so hot. It's love that carries you through. And anything we can do to help consumers at least catch a glimpse of that kind of affection that farming and gardening does for people, that will do a whole lot to transform the imaginations. That will also, I think, help them become better advocates for good food and agricultural practices.
Sorry, if I could just have one quick one. I do have a background in the hospitality industry, and we did a lot of sort of table to farm dinners, which were launched by some of the chefs. I lived in the Caribbean for the last 15 years, and we used a lot of those products. And it was quite interesting to see the response of a customer. And a lot of our customers were US based, and it was quite difficult with the tastes and the flavors, of say fresh collard greens coming from a natural farm, a free range chicken, even an egg, simple things like that. And we were quite amazed, because this beautiful food is being produced, but the customers were so conditioned to the frozen, multi-manufactured things. It was an interesting challenge. So, sorry, I just thought.
Yeah, no, education is so important. People need to know how to make sense of what they're experiencing.
So we're going to give people a chance to share. There was a woman in my breakout group that just wanted to make a comment, and I told her she could do that at the beginning of the sharing time. So Betty, if you want to unmute yourself, you can share your comment now, and then we'll continue on.
Okay. This is addressed to Norman, and I would love to be able to see his face if I could.
You need to just look for him through the, or you can, if you can find him in the participants list, you can click pin, and then you'll be able to see his face in front, or you can look through your list.
Under view, gallery view. So Norman, where are you? Norman, you impress me with your intellect and with your heart. And I understand that you're a university professor, is that right?
Yes.
Well, your circle of influence then is enormous. And I would wager a bet that you speak to your students, lucky them. You speak to your students the way you've spoken to us, and I'm not at the crying stage yet, as some of your parishioners were when you spoke to them, but I definitely have had, there's been an emotional connection, such as the one that Tom Mulcair spoke of last night, and I had this epiphany, and perhaps it's been already in my mind, and maybe it was planted a long time ago in a Sunday school class or in a sermon. But when you started speaking about food, I had this epiphany, and it's just this, that we're talking about food for the body, and I took it to food for the mind, to food for the spirit, and I put an adjective in front of all those foods. And I realized that what we put into our body and our mind and our spirit determines who we are. And we've been gifted with all of that food. And then our job, I believe, as Christians, is that we gift other people in whatever way we can. And I'm very grateful that I came to last night's session. My husband and I spoke about it until 12 o'clock, actually. And I didn't speak last night, but I was inspired to speak today, and I'm really grateful for being part of last night and also this morning. And to anyone who's been involved in preparation of this conference, I laud you, because I know it's an enormous amount of work, and I laud you for the work that you do as Christians. And so kudos, Norman. A pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. I think you speak for many of us in the comments that you've shared. So if people would like to share some of what was discussed in their small groups, we have about 5 for 6 minutes to do that before we should close up. And then again, you can send any further comments to that email address that have been provided, or you can put them in the chat, and I'm copying the full text of the chat and putting it into a document. So Janet, I'll invite you to share first.
So it was a really wide conversation we had, and I'm going to bring up a few points. And I'll start with our last point, which is, COVID-19 has brought isolation. Think of all our children, the next generation, who may have not yet ever met a cow. In my life, I heard of that 18 years ago. People have not gone to farms. And if they're not in school and taking these day trips, they may actually never get to that point before who knows at what age. So how can we in our communities actually organize, farm visits or meeting your local cow and bring people forward? So I want to start us off with, all the possibilities. 10 people.
You would start to say, come to church and meet a cow.
Well, we need the metaphors, right? We need to get people out. And, I live in Ottawa, but my congregation is Elphin, Ontario, and it is an agricultural area. And we are wondering, where is the next generation of newness other than cottagers? That a local action is 10 people in a conversation. 10 people. Contact them, whether they be in your congregations, your friends, your family, whether it's by a note or a telephone call. But then we talked about how, and I think there's a sense of what are the high points coming out of this? How can we distill that so that we can have something easy to use? So it's almost like a tool, because there is a sense of being overwhelmed. So what can we do? And the we is us here, who might actually raise their hand to kind of sketch out, a scaffolding kind of message, and then people have something that they can work with. Farmers markets, there's been an increased demand in Ottawa. In other places, we now see them in subway stations. So how can we use those? How can we work with those places so that we make the connection between what we've been talking about for 3 days? And then I look at the synod. Some form of strategy for the synod. Is it that there be a group of people? Yes, there was an organizing committee for this, but if we're looking to outreach to existing organizations, and we've had like the Canadian Food Grains Bank, that's, a resource. We have Citizens for Public Justice. How might our relationship grow with them? And with the others, I put in a list of them as they've just been churning in me, bringing out organizations that I've learned in my life, in my journey on agriculture and food and organics. To say that, we've had this session, we're looking for next action. How can we either leverage what you have, or how can we become involved in what you have so that our voices can also be used by others, and that their voices can also be used by us? So that's a very concise.
Wonderful. Thanks, Janet. Ghassan.
Yes, there was kind of a collective thinking about the church need to be active on social justice or injustice, on food insecurity, on inequality, growing inequality, and through church objectives and mission, and of course, congregation involvement, to support agrarian communities in rural areas, congregation to be active and communicate to their deputies, to help as well mitigate, create policies to mitigate inequality and injustice. And of course, within church, to educate and remind people always to give thanks and say grace. In some community, they try to have a community garden initiative but it did not work. Different reason, pending community effort, availability, and manpower. So again, it is suggested that the church should have an objective and be leading congregation toward achieving those small but important goals. This is a very brief. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, we covered a lot of the things that that I'm sure everybody did about use of land, especially in urban areas, and the reclamation from our backyard farms to city space to our own church properties. But one of the things that we kind of got on, as my wife mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of ministry in rural areas, and the really important thing that I think we need to do is to be educating ourselves on how farming really works, and acknowledging that it really is agribusiness now. Farming is very the family farm is a really challenging thing. These days it's agribusiness, and I brought up the example of pork because I had a lot of pork producers in my past congregation, and I don't think many people recognize that pork is a multi-step process now. A pig that you eat doesn't grow up on one farm. It is born, raised, and slaughtered there, but moves from farm to farm to be first weaned and started the process of fattening, and then to be finished in another barn in another farm, and then to be trucked away, and all of that is pretty much governed by the large companies that are doing that are the end recipients of the pig. And for most farmers in the last, I can speak confidently for about the last 12 years, pork has been one of those industries where farmers haven't made any money at all. They've been losing, and they don't have the ability to recoup, to change their price because it's set by the company. So there are things like that I think just need our own consciousness, and all of us can kind of be learning kind of the cornfield down the road. Where does that corn actually go? Is an interesting question that most people don't know, and you kind of wonder about it. And like I grew up in a rural area. Now we weren't, granted, my father was not a farmer, but I grew up with farm kids, and we were around farms all the time. But in the 30 years that I've been in ministry, moving across the country, I've had my mind absolutely blown from moving from Prince Edward Island, where every farmer drove a Massey 230 tractor when I was a kid, to the first time I met an air seeder coming over the hill in Saskatchewan. That was, took up the whole road to get down the street. There are just such a variety of things that we do in this country under the guise of agriculture that I think we need to be very much aware of, and all of those concerns are very different and very regional. So that I think is just being aware of what's in our food, how it gets to our table, and then once we have that information, then we can do advocacy with government and other leaders, like the folks we had last evening in the town hall, about how do we shift policy to enable just and fair food production and distribution.
Thank you, Robert. I'm just going to give Phyllis, if you've just got a minute or so, if you can share what you heard from your small group.
Well, our farm small group, mainly we talked about education as being one way to make people more aware of agriculture. And because we are farmers, a lot of our farm organizations have videos etc., that can be shared with a congregation. Like last Sunday, we did a World Food Day service, and we highlighted bees. And I know Norman talked about the importance of bees, and so many people learned about a hive and the workers, and we tied that into how we should be caring for each other and being an example like a bee in the world. And so I think that's our main focus, was looking at education. And right now with the pandemic, there's very few opportunities to gather or do farm visits. So the video idea is something you could pursue and show at a service or for Sunday school or whatever.
Wonderful. Thanks, Phyllis. We have reached the end of the time for our conference. As people have been asking in the chat, I will take all of the ideas that have been shared, as many as I can, and we will share them out hopefully towards the end of next week. We have been recording all of these sessions, and that probably won't be available until mid-November. But again, an email will be sent out with links to the YouTube channel where all of that information or where the recordings will be available. If you'd like to go back and watch them, if you'd like to share them with other people, we want to make it available as widely as possible so other people can have the benefits of learning. Norman's going to get the final word, but before I let him do that, I just, on behalf of the committee that put this conference together, I just want to say thank you so very much for the time that you've given, for the care that you've spent, for your passion and for your love for God's creation. It's just been a wonderful few days. I know I have learned a ton, and lots of people have, and I feel inspired and I feel hopeful about things that we can do. And I think that's because of your approach. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And my parting word to you is, I don't have a solution for everybody. I think you all have the solutions within your own communities. And I encourage you each to turn to each other and talk more about how your communities can be places for the nurture of life. Each community, each congregation will have distinct things that they can do, and only they can do. But it begins when we talk and listen to each other to determine what the needs are and what our potential to help is, and then come alongside people who are doing really good work. And, we've got many who are doing it. We heard yesterday from Shirley, and it's just wonderful to see that we've got people who are taking a leadership role in collective action. And my dream and my hope is that communities of faith can join with people who are doing the good that our world desperately needs. So I encourage you, and I know that each of you will have distinct, wonderful things you can do. So carry on.
Norman, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Sure. Let's pray. Creator Spirit, who loves every place and every creature, who stays intimately present to each living being as the life within its life, open our hearts to your love for every creature. Open our minds to know what we can do to become active participants in the healing of our planet and our communities. Bless each one here today. Help them to feel the love of you pulsing through their own bodies as they go out into the world to witness to the life that has always been good and beautiful. Amen.